Hey everybody, welcome back and thank you so much for joining us. This is the next episode of Authors Bantering. I'm Josh Breslin, that's Ian M. Rogers. This week it's all about the opener, right? The opening lines, that intro, how to start your novel off. So much pressure is placed upon this, mainly because as writers, we've always been told that your reader is going to look at the first lines and they're going to make a decision about whether they go for your book based upon the opening, right? The agent that looks at your work, they're going to see just your first, few pages here. You got to make your opener really, really strong. So how do we start, right? How do we start our novels? And I would suggest by starting off by not putting as much pressure, to be honest, on the opening. I think as important as it can be, I think too many people put way too much pressure on it. But to get into the practical advice, at least for me, I think the big thing to keep in mind is you have a lot of freedom with what you want to do. You have a ton of freedom. And this is probably the one time in your book where you can be as shameless as you would like. And in fact, I mean, to be real here, it seems
tell
that
me more about Shameless. I'm interested in Shameless. I'm not like
yeah.
I'm
So
curious
what I
what
mean
you mean
basically
by that.
is out of context statements that raise questions in your reader's mind. So, for example, 1984, right? The opening, right? It was a windy day and the clocks were striking 13, right? That's the opening line. I sure I butchered it, but the point is you're thinking in your head, well, clocks don't go to 13, they only go to 12. So what's that, right? It's very shameless, right? You're writing something that you know is deliberately having a psychological effect on the reader, and you're playing kind of a mind game with them, right? This is the one time you really get a chance to do it. You can be authoritative and you can do it, and I would encourage you to take advantage of that. Um, there are different techniques with it, obviously, but I think that's the main thing to keep in mind is use it to be as shameless as possible. All of your favorite, stories, for I think the most part, have a degree of this to some varying use. It can be either creating a mystery, right? You have the Dark Tower series, the first one, the Gunslinger, right? I think it was the man in black fled across the desert, the gunslinger followed. That's shameless in that we don't know who these characters are, and you're writing it deliberately in a way that makes us more curious about what's going on, even though it also summarizes the entire text as well. So there are different techniques, but keep in mind that you can be shameless and encourage yourself to do that. Um, I'm
Yeah,
not sure
this
about
is
you, Ian, but
no,
yeah,
this is making a lot of sense. My counter to that, not even in a devil's advocate kind of way, but in a just writing is more complicated kind of way, is that there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's
yeah,
more than one way to set up an opening. I think especially traditionally, if you look at the history of the novel, the kind of again, to use your term, shameless, more attention grabbing opening is really a very recent phenomenon. If you go back to 100 years, you're not going to see that as much, and certainly
mm,
not in the 19th century. You're going to have more slow openings where they're starting with long descriptions of things. I'm thinking about In Cold Blood, where that book isn't even that old, but the first
yeah,
chapter is really just a whole
describing,
unpacking of this town. It really,
yeah,
really gets in there very, very slowly, including on that opening page. And again, that's the way he very intentionally sets that book up. But and again, writing's changed a lot since then. I think now, you mentioned the very, very real pressure that a lot of unpublished writers are under, is that when they're submitting their work, they're submitting a first page, or if they're submitting to a journal or a magazine or a contest or whatever, the person reading is going to start with the first page, and they're going to be sorting through dozens, hundreds, however many submissions, and you're going to need to stand out from that crowd. You
mm-hmm.
don't have name recognition to potentially make the person take you a little bit seriously. You potentially don't have trust with the reader yet, and so you really need to grab that trust with that first page. And so the kind of shameless opening that you're talking about, I think, has evolved from that need we have as unpublished writers, or independent writers, or writers who are looking to make more of our name for ourselves, get more attention, to make our writing stand out in that sense.
Yeah,
And in that sense, I think, in a purely just technical terms, a shameless attention grabbing, in media res, jumping right in opening, can really serve that purpose very effectively. So it's the idea that you can throw readers in the middle of a problem or give them a scenario where they want to know how it's going to be resolved. And you can do that, not slowly, not gradually, but in mid sentence or mid problem potentially. And again, there's a lot of different ways of doing that. One thing I see sometimes is that a lot of writers feel compelled to start stories in this way where maybe they don't want to. So maybe they have another opening that to them feels more natural or more conducive to the story or is more of what they want to do, but they feel like, oh, this isn't attention grabbing enough or it's not exciting
Yeah.
enough. And so they feel compelled to maybe throw that opening away and then replace it with something that's more of what you just described. And maybe they don't have a good impression of what that looks like, so it comes out sounding a little bit strange or not what they really want, or they're not able to put their full energy behind it. Whereas maybe that original opening that they had, which wasn't as, again, to use your word, shameless or in media res or attention grabbing, maybe that opening could be tweaked or streamlined or even just polished up a little bit to serve the, again, maybe a little bit slower, but serve the as the segue into the story that the reader needs for that particular writer. Is this kind of the opposite way of looking at it? Is this making sense?
It is. Yeah, so it definitely is. And you're right. I am kind of more the position of like how it is today. I gave a couple examples, obviously, from books that didn't get published, in the past, even the century, right? But with that, I feel like most works today do tend to follow that sort of formula, as annoying as
They
it
do.
might be,
They
right?
do.
Like
They
every
do.
I
I'm
can,
the first one to
yeah,
admit that.
every single story tries to hook you with this weird opening, and yes, for a lot of books that I don't like, they don't master the art of making it look natural. And so if you are
Yeah.
writing
Yes. 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 Yes.
less, if
A
it's
bad writer will
yes,
have an opening that is attention grabbing or is shameless, but it'll do it in an unnatural way or in a very contrived way that feels
yes,
once you
yep,
can once you step back and look at it, it feels very okay. This person added this paragraph clearly to get my
just to
attention,
pull
to
you in.
hook me in.
Bingo. Yeah,
And that makes me
yeah.
feel cheated as a reader because it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
feel organic to the story. I can see the strings in
Absolutely,
that
yeah,
sense.
yeah. Natural, yeah. Being natural, it naturally occurring has to come before anything else. I agree. So, and I'm a bit of a hypocrite myself, right? I've never written a story with a shameless opening before. I've not, at least no novel, right? Neither
I
novel that
wouldn't say
I
okay,
have.
okay, but maybe I still your openings that I've seen, I think they've still kind of gone in that attention grabbing direction,
They
and they've
do, but
hooked
it's
the
yeah,
reader in a way that I would argue is very natural.
yeah,
Thinking about your book Crease, for example, where it starts off with the billboard on the truck, for
yes,
example, and
yeah. And there's a
we're
little bit of like
seeing
a
that
tease with that,
billboard,
but
and it's
yeah,
not, the clocks aren't striking 13 in that opening sentence, but they're showing us something that's very specific, and it
mm-hmm,
makes us want to know what it is and know a little bit more about it,
yeah,
which is that truck. So, and again, that feels natural. It doesn't feel like a ploy to get my attention. It's not artificial
mm-hmm.
in that way.
Absolutely, yep, exactly. And it's good to keep it natural, and it's also good to maybe consider this more at the end as well, right? Like the best time to think about your beginning is when you finish your work, like finish your first draft, because then you know what you want your story to say.
Yeah.
You ever get it clear, and then it's a little bit easier to write that beginning. Not so much that you want to tie the beginning with like the ending or whatever like that, but just you know what your story is going to say, and you know where to start in the ideas and maybe the themes you want to express, and maybe you can weave that in, right? It's something like The Great Gatsby, the opening line there, right? About, and I don't know the exact quote, but like the guy saying, my dad once told me, don't be so judgmental. You had a more privileged life than most people, so don't be so harsh when you
Yes.
think of others. And then he's like, but something happened that's made me reconsider this, right? And then the story begins. That's very natural, and it's a little bit shameless because it's sort of setting up a bit of a mystery here about this character for us. But it does. It feels natural with the story, and it fits the theme of trying to
Yes.
understand the
I
character of Gatsby and his relationship and his kind of his ethics in relationship to the character of Nick and his situation as well. Yeah.
and I wasn't around when Fitzgerald was writing that. Maybe he said this in some interview or something, but I can guarantee you he did not come up with that opening line before he came up with the story of The Great Gatsby. He came up with the story first and then went back and then figured out that opening line. And I think
Yeah.
speaks to the core of what you're getting at, because if you as a writer are doing the reverse of that, you've got a great opening line and you throw it out there in a great opening paragraph and you've got the reader's attention. Here's your hook. Now where do I go? Where's my story? You're gonna stumble, and then your story maybe isn't gonna feel clean, or it's gonna zigzag in a strange direction because your opening is going to feel separate from the story that you end up telling. And
Bingo.
the result is going to be this, it's not going to feel organic. The themes are not going to be there. They're not going to be tied as closely as they need to be.
Bingo. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's exactly it. You have to have the theme. You have to have what you want to talk about, what the story is going to explore. That can play a big factor into these intros and these sort of classic lines that we all remember. And most likely, yeah, none of these lines that we know were ever written before the story was actually written itself, right? It's hard to imagine someone pantsed that opening line and then wrote the story basically in accordance with that. Usually, you're right. You definitely get the sense that it's sort of the line sort of followed the clear picture that was had once the story itself was for the most part written and then kind of added in later on. Maybe not, but that's definitely a sense I
Well, no,
get
no.
too.
This is I'm trying to think of. So the one contrary example I can think of is Catch 22, actually, where Joseph Heller has gone on the record and said, "Okay, I was lying in bed, and then the first line of the novel came to me. It was love at first sight. The first time Yosarian saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him, and then the story sort of evolved from that. And he I've seen an interview with him where he talks about how he wasn't even sure what kind of chaplain it was going to be. It could have been a prison chaplain, not necessarily a military chaplain. I will, again, I'll quibble with that a little bit, and I'll say that he again probably had some notion of the themes or things that he wanted to convey with a story like that, with the love at first sight story. And so, in a sense, it was probably not strictly a case of opening line and then make a story to suit it. But again, I think that's a pretty good counterexample. Is if he has an opening and then he starts and then he uses that to draw us into this bigger world in that case, because people forget this, but Catch 22 actually starts off pretty slowly. The entire first chapter, Yosarian is just in the hospital. It's very contained. So we're only seeing a few people at this point, and we don't really see more of the characters or know more about what's going on until we get to chapter 2.
Good point. Okay. And that's
that's just kind of my quick counterexample.
Well, no, it's good to have that. It's good to have the exception to the rule here, but I think like that more or less kind of goes to show that for the most part, these authors are coming up with these things after they've already written these stories here. So if you're struggling with your opening line, don't worry about it until your later drafts, until it goes on, and then you can start kind of crafting maybe an idea that maybe plays around with that. And there's so many different techniques, right? You can have everything from like the summarizing the whole story, right? Which what you see with like, the gunslinger. You can do the straight shameless like 1984, right? You can do just more of a kind of traditional slow opening, right? You gave the example of In Cold Blood where he describes the Kansas town very early on because the murder is supposed to be a shocking kind of counter to the sort of picturesque Americana that the people in the 1950s had come to know. There are different techniques and different ways of doing it, but the bigger idea and the bigger theme, I guess, to get through to this is, as endless as the techniques are, you got to know what your story is first. You have to know what you want to explore, and from there, it's easier to kind of string these little openers along to start them off.
If I were to end on one note, like one takeaway that people watching this video should have, it's exactly that. You have to know your story. And if you know your story and what the core of your story is, you will be able to make every sentence, every page, everything, every character, every nuance match that core. And the opening in that respect is just one piece of a story that's going to reflect back to that core. And so the counter example where I had where, maybe a writer wrote an opening before they wrote the story and the two feel very disconnected, or it feels like the opening is just a hook for hook's sake, something like that. Openings like that do not connect to the core of a story that we've been getting at. So again, as a writer, you owe it to yourself to really, really understand what's going on.
Perfect. Excellent. And I think on that, we can kind of wrap this one up. With that, I know we didn't go into too many specifics here, but I think it's more important to get the overall concept first, and then you can find any number of techniques by reading books to extrapolate from. And with that, I think we'll sign off here. As always, we do take kind of questions about certain topics from the audience, so leave in the comments anything you want to go over. And with that, we will be back next week. My name's Josh Bresslin, that's Ian M. Rogers, and we will see you later.
Take it easy.